Number 9. Walt Disney's private airplane. During the planning stages for what would eventually become Disney World in Orlando, Walt Disney flew back and forth between California and Florida on a Grumman G-159 aircraft codenamed the Mouse. Throughout 1964 and 1965, it ferried Disney and other company executives between the two destinations once a week. This made it the most utilized Gulfstream in worldwide corporate service, according to WDW News Today. It was retired in 1992 in favor of a corporate jet. For a long time, the Grumman was on display at Disney's Hollywood studios. In 2018, it was discovered in a backstage area, where it was apparently being stored after it was removed from public view. 2 years later, aerial photos revealed that the plane had been covered in what appeared to be a protective tarp. It's unclear whether the company has any plans for the aircraft or if it'll end up back on public display at any point. Number 8. Jin Shui Yuan 2. In early 2022, offshore oil rig workers spotted a vessel listing in the Gulf of Thailand in the middle of the night. The 262-foot-long ship featured Chinese characters that translate to Jin Shui Yuan 2. Its crew was nowhere to be found, and it contained no cargo or identifying documents, but was full of guns, leaving its origins and purpose a mystery. Authorities said that the ship's bridge appeared as if it were abandoned in a hurry, and that its galley looked as if it hadn't been used in quite some time. The Thai Navy attempted to tow the vessel to the coast, but it sank in rough weather, leaving a kilometers-long wide oil leak in its wake. They issued a notice advising its owner to remove it within the next 15 days. An expert speculated that the ship may have been an illegal oil tanker making deliveries to various countries. If that's the case, it would have likely gone a long time without maintenance, since it's difficult for an illegal vessel to find a place to dock, which would perhaps explain its abandonment. Number 7. Out-of-place fighter jet. In the hilly forest of northern New Jersey near West Milford, there's a wrecked fighter jet that sits in pieces among the brush. An outdoorsman discovered it while hunting deer in the woods in the early 2000s, and was surprised that he never knew about it, having lived in the area for over 40 years. Trees have grown all around the wreck, indicating that it's been there for many years, yet when the man asked other locals if they knew about it, they said they didn't. The hunter contacted Weird New Jersey about the mysterious jet, and it published a story in hopes that a reader might know more about the aircraft's origins. According to a letter sent in by a reader, the jet crashed in 1967. After receiving reports about the accident, police followed the smell of smoke and sheared treetops to find the wreck. The area surrounding the plane was on fire, and the pilot was sitting on its wing in a dazed and confused state. 30 feet away, sitting against a tree, was the pilot's friend. Luckily, neither of the men had life-threatening injuries. They revealed that the aircraft went down during a routine training mission, but the exact cause of the crash remains unclear to this day. The military removed the engine but left the rest of the downed plane at the site. Due to the condition of the wreck, its make and model are not immediately clear by looking at it. An old photo revealed that it's a Marine Lockheed Martin T-2V Sea Star. Around 150 of the aircraft were built starting in the 1950s, and they were retired in the 1970s. Only one known airworthy Sea Star still exists, and there are 2 preserved planes on display at museums, making the wreck one of only a handful of remaining examples of the aircraft. Number 6. B-307 submarine. Measuring just under 300 feet long and 29 feet across their widest point, the Tango-class submarines were the Soviet Union's largest class of conventional submarines ever built. The first Tango-class vessels entered service in 1972, and 18 were built between then and 2016, when the last one in service was decommissioned. 3 of the retired subs have been preserved. One of them, known as B-307, sits at a park complex in Tolyatti. It was launched in 1980 as the 14th Tango-class vessel. The sub served primarily in the Mediterranean Sea and parts of the Atlantic for 9 years before being taken out of service in 1989. This was due to the Soviet Union's declining economy. It was initially placed on reserve, but it never saw service again. B-307 was struck from the Naval Register in 2001 and slated for scrapping, but the Autovaz Technical Museum bought it and spared it from being dismantled. In 2003, it was mounted on specially built pontoons and began the long and complicated journey to its new home. It took over a year before the submarine was moved to shore, at which point it was moved along a specially built road to its current location. If you had the chance to travel across the ocean in a submarine, would you? Tell us in the comments below and hit the subscribe button while you're at it. Number 5. Experimental Soviet aircraft. Starting in the 1960s, Soviet engineers began experimenting with ground effect vehicles, which resembled space-age airplanes but operated much differently than traditional aircraft. These unusual machines, known as ekranoplans, generated lift by flying roughly 13 feet above the water, which made them difficult for enemies to detect. Known as the ground effect, this created a cushion of air for the vehicle to glide along. During the 1970s, the Soviets designed the Lun-class ekranoplane based on a previously built prototype nicknamed the Caspian Sea Monster. Only one Lun ekranoplane was ever built to completion. Known as the MD-160, it served for the Soviet and Russian navies from 1987 to sometime during the late 90s. Measuring 242 feet long and with a 140-foot wingspan, the colossal 63-foot-tall aircraft dwarfed modern-day jumbo jets. It had a maximum cruising speed of 340 miles per hour and was operated by a 15-person crew. Throughout its service life, it was the world's heaviest aircraft. It carried 6 supersonic missile launchers and was equipped for anti-surface warfare. The MD-160 was stored on a purpose-built dry floating dock, which was towed out into the water and sunk beneath the ekranoplane, leaving it ready to power up and go. It could remain self-sufficient for up to 5 days before it needed any servicing. A new Lund-class model was around 90% finished when the program was abruptly cancelled due to a lack of funds. The existing MD-160 was taken out of service. Until 2020, the retired aircraft sat in a naval base in Kaspisk, Russia. It was towed to a beach in Dagestan along the Caspian Sea coast, where it remains today as a tourist attraction. Number 4. The MV Kalakala. The iconic passenger and car ferry MV Kalakala entered service in Washington's Puget Sound on the 4th of July in 1935. Famous for its spacecraft-like Art Deco design and luxury accommodations, it soon became recognized as the world's second most photographed object. In addition to offering ferry service, the 270-foot-long ship was used for moonlight cruises, hosting a live dance orchestra. It was voted top attraction among visitors during the 1962 Seattle World's Fair, second only to the Space Needle in popularity. While the Kalakala had an appealing, unique look, its aircraft-inspired design proved impractical in several ways. It had a small wheelhouse with poor visibility, and its vehicle carrying capacity was reduced by 40% in the years following World War II as American cars got wider. Passengers had an increasingly difficult time squeezing between the vehicles when they boarded and disembarked from the ferry. During the 1950s, more efficient vessels were designed, and by the end of the decade, the Kalakala was obsolete. But it continued to provide ferry service until its retirement in 1967. It was briefly used as a crabbing ship in Alaska before returning to Washington under its former owner's plans to restore it, which never happened. The Kalakala languished in Puget Sound for years until it was finally scrapped in 2015. Number 3. Remote Train Graveyard. There's a collection of mysterious abandoned trains rusting away on a vast tract of land in north-central Bangkok. It's hidden within Thailand's largest freight depot, where it sits derelict and forgotten, and in stark contrast to the many locomotives that drive past it every day. One urban explorer who runs the photography blog Spectral Codex visited the site and took the time to research some of the decaying cars. The findings revealed that some of them were manufactured in the US by Davenport Locomotive Works, a company that went out of business in 1956, which speaks to how old some of the trains are. Many of the cars were traced to a series of Herschel diesel hydraulic locomotives that were built during the early 1960s. A security guard told photographer Dax Ward that the collection has been at the site for around 20 years. Nobody seems to know what the cars were used for before they arrived or anything else about their past. There's one other train graveyard in Bangkok known as Makasan. It's located on the outskirts of the city. It can be seen while riding the train from the airport to the city center, but it's strictly off-limits to the public. The sprawling 186-acre site functions primarily as a state-owned repair yard. In 2018, authorities granted CNN journalists a rare look at the property, which is reportedly filled with rows upon rows of aging and overgrown train cars in varying conditions, including around 1,000 passenger carriages. Some are completely destroyed from being in accidents, while others are visibly dated but otherwise seem to be in good condition. The collection spills over into the nearby woods, where there are a pair of World War II-era Japanese steam engines that once ran along the country's rail line into neighboring Myanmar. Number 2. Soviet missile carriers. In a part of Russia that was once an impassable swamp, the ground has started to dry up in recent years, giving explorer and Instagrammer Oleg Suakin a chance to ride beyond it for the first time with his ATV. Deep in the wilderness, he spotted some rusting barbed wire and carefully followed it, eventually coming on a pair of rusting Soviet-era 8x8 vehicles. There was no obvious signs to indicate what the machines might have been used for, but it was clear that they had been languishing in the forest for a very long time. The vehicles were stripped of many of their parts, making it even more difficult to identify their exact purpose. Inside the cab of one of the massive trucks, Suakin spotted a lever and realized it was used by the Soviet Army to transport ballistic missiles. By doing some additional research, he discovered that the vehicle wasn't used for launching missiles, but for providing necessary support. A trailer attached to the truck functioned as a living space for troops, with designated cooking, resting, and planning areas. There are as many as 10 different rooms separated by a narrow corridor and sliding doors. The exact make and model of the vehicles are unknown. Like many other Soviet relics, they were likely abandoned after the Iron Curtain fell in the early 90s. At the time, the countries of the former Soviet Union were busy resuscitating their infrastructure and militaries, and the money to upkeep many of the USSR's ambitious programs was no longer there. And at number 1, ZIL E-167. During the Soviet era, the state devoted a lot of money to designing experimental all-terrain vehicles for a variety of purposes and environments. Over a period of just 2 months during the early 1960s, engineers developed a 6-wheeled off-road truck called the ZIL E-167. Its intended purpose was to be able to withstand Siberia's harsh climate, which meant that it would ideally be capable of navigating in snow and rough terrain. The heavy-duty vehicle was also designed to make water crossings. Powered by 2 8-cylinder engines, this 10-foot-tall, 30-foot-long beast was an imposing force. Its operators could control its tire pressure, and it was also equipped with air cleaning systems, a system for pumping water in the event of a fire, and radio transmission capabilities. With 6-foot tires and 33-inch ground clearance, the ZIL E-167 traversed boulders, ravines, uneven ground, and up to 3 feet of snow with ease. Only one prototype was ever built. Throughout its testing phase, it covered around 12,500 miles of ground throughout Russia and only got stuck to the point of needing to be towed once. As impressive as it was, the vehicle had its drawbacks, including a shockingly low fuel efficiency of just 2.3 miles to the gallon, or about 1 kilometer to each liter. Its size also meant that it wasn't usable on most public roads, which was a crucial requirement for a vehicle of its kind. Plans to build 2 more units were ultimately scrapped, most likely in favor of a more widely produced vehicle. The sole prototype has been restored and is on display at the State Military Technical Museum in Ivanovskoye.
9. Forte da Laje. In 1555, a Frenchman named Nicolas Durand Villegagnon tried unsuccessfully to take possession of a small island off the Brazilian state of Rio de Janeiro. Located in Guanabara Bay, it was the perfect place to set up an offensive battery against the Portuguese. But the government of Portugal thwarted the attempt and soon began planning to use the island for its own use. Then, in 1584, former governor of Rio de Janeiro Salvador Correa de Sá had the idea to build a huge fort on the island. They named the stronghold Tamandaré da Laje, and work finally began during the second half of the 17th century. It was completed around 1690, and it sort of resembles a beached whale made of metal. It underwent numerous renovations over the following centuries, including when it was damaged from bombings during the 1893 Armada Revolt. Today, the island is the property of the Brazilian army, but it's in a deteriorating state due to a lack of maintenance and damage from seawater and bad weather. However, there's apparently plans in works to improve its condition and turn it into a tourist attraction. 8. Clipperton Island. Just west of Mexico in the eastern Pacific, there's a tiny isolated atoll or coral island known as Clipperton. It's uninhabited today, but people lived there for a short time during the early 20th century. Looking at the barren island, which has no source of fresh water, it's hard to understand why anyone would want to settle there. But it was once abundant with guano or bat droppings, which is a highly effective fertilizer and an exceptionally profitable commodity. Eager to cash in on the valuable manure, the British Pacific Island Company built a mining operation on the island with permission from the Mexican government. Around 100 men moved there for work and brought their families along. They received their necessities every 2 months from a passing supply ship. During the Mexican Revolution, these routine visits stopped, and the people on Clipperton Island were forgotten about. The remaining inhabitants suffered without food, medication, and other necessities. At one point, a passing American ship offered help, but the island's leader, Captain Ramon Arnaud, stubbornly refused the assistance. In his mind, he still believed that Mexico would come to Clipperton's aid. By 1915, malnutrition and scurvy killed nearly everyone on the island. Even more lives were claimed when Arnaud and 3 men set out in a canoe to try and catch up with the distant ship, but they ultimately capsized and drowned. By 1917, only 1 man remained along with 15 women and children. The sole surviving man embarked on a campaign of sexual assault and murder and then declared himself king of Clipperton. But Arnaud's wife and another woman killed him, and by a stroke of luck, the remaining survivors were rescued hours later by a US Navy vessel. The settlement's ruins still litter the island to this day, but they don't receive any visitors due to the remoteness of Clipperton. 7. Hashima Island. Located off the coast of Nagasaki, Japan, Hashima is a small, partially man-made 16-acre island that was once a home to a coal mining facility and a surrounding settlement that grew rapidly to accommodate workers and their families. It was immensely crowded with concrete tower blocks, which were connected by a series of overhead pedestrian bridges, as well as a maze of streets and underground tunnels. There was also a growing number of pools, shops, schools, and other public structures that were built to accommodate Hashima's flourishing population. At one point, the island became so jam-packed that it was expanded with a waste coal slag landfill. As many as 6 people were crammed into each apartment due to the fact that there's simply no other place to put them. At its peak, Hashima was home to 5,259 residents, with a population density of 216,264 residents per square mile. To give you an idea, that's several times more crowded than modern-day Manhattan, which boasts a population density of 72,918 people per square mile. The demand for coal eventually decreased, and in 1974, the mine closed its doors. After nearly a century of use, Hashima was abandoned. Many families left their belongings behind, and the structures throughout the island were left as is. The once bustling city now sits eerily silent and is crumbling from decades of decay. The ruins at Hashima are unstable and dangerous. Visitors can catch a distant glimpse of the buildings from passing boats during guided tours, but exploring the island requires special permission from local authorities. 6. Deception Island. Situated among the South Shetland Islands near the Antarctic Peninsula, Deception Island is the caldera of an active volcano. Its first reported sighting was in 1820 by British sealers William Smith and Edward Bransfield. The island functioned as an ideal natural harbour, with little ice and wind. Shortly after its discovery, it attracted fur seal hunters who spent summers on the island. But the fur sealing industry dwindled over just a handful of years due to overhunting, and the men who stayed on Deception Island left behind little to no archaeological evidence of their stay. Explorers continued to stop there and conducted topographical surveys and other studies, but the island didn't experience a second phase of human habitation until the early 20th century. It became a hub for moored factory ships for the whaling industry. These ships needed access to a large supply of fresh water, and they also required sheltered anchorage, and Deception Island seemed like the ideal spot. During peak years, there were several hundred whalers staying there at any given time during the Antarctic summer. In 1908, the British government declared the island to be a part of its Falkland Islands dependencies. British postal services and other infrastructure were established there, including customs officers, to ensure that whalers were paying licensing fees and complying with fishing quotas. The same year, a cemetery was created, and in 1912, a radio station and hand-operated railway were established. There was also a magistrate's house and a permanent onshore whaling station, which yielded extremely high profits during its operating years, making it the only successful shore-based industry to ever operate in Antarctica. But the success was short-lived, and in 1931, the factory's operations ceased. Scientific research continued, and over the following decades, various countries fought over control of Deception Island, including Britain, Argentina, Norway, and Chile. But the activities there were interrupted by volcanic eruptions in 1967 and 1969. Today, most of the buildings remain abandoned, and the island is mainly a tourist attraction, drawing around 15,000 guests per year. There are 2 active research stations operated by Argentina and Spain during the summer, and several countries continue to assert sovereignty to the territory. 5. Spike Island. During the mid-19th century, people fled Ireland in droves during what became known as the Great Potato Famine. But leaving wasn't a choice for everyone. As emigrants sailed out of Cork Harbour, they caught a glimpse of Spike Island, home to the country's most notorious prison. Many of the inmates there were locked up for theft, which was on the rise as millions of people teetered on the brink of starvation. The sprawling complex on Spike Island originally functioned as a military base. It was later converted into a prison during the 1840s to accommodate the overflow of inmates from other penitentiaries. At its peak, the overcrowded facility housed as many as 2,500 prisoners despite being designed to only accommodate a few hundred. At one point in time, this place was the world's largest prison. The drinking water was contaminated with sewage and food was scarce. Medical care was poor at best, with just one doctor available to treat the entire population. Malnourished and ailing inmates were forced to perform brutal hard labor. Given the dismal conditions, it's not surprising that over 1,000 prisoners died during the facility's first 7 years of operation. They were buried in a graveyard on the island, which was eventually covered by a landfill to conceal the mass deaths that were occurring there. The Spike Island prison continued to operate until the late 20th century, when it was converted into a youth correctional facility. It closed its doors for good in 2004 and has since become a tourist attraction and memorial. There are numerous underground tunnels and fortresses at the site, which were sealed up when they were no longer needed, but they've only been partially excavated. Last year, archaeologists found a hidden stone staircase and tunnel dating back to the 18th century. In it, they found animal bones and wine bottles, some of which were half full. As more discoveries continue to be made, experts are piecing together a more complete picture of the site's complex history. They also hope to find out what really went on at the prison at a time when oversight was minimal and treatment towards criminals was strict at best. If you could name your own private island, what would you call it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. 4. St. Kilda. St. Kilda is an archipelago consisting of 4 small islands, located at the westernmost edge of Scotland's Outer Hebrides Islands. Their history of human habitation is thought to date back at least 2,000 years to the Bronze Age. The population peaked at 180 during the 17th century. Over the years, the number of people living in St. Kilda fluctuated, eventually dropping to just 36 in 1930. That year, the remaining population was evacuated from St. Kilda's largest island, Herta. The people of Herta lived in unique stone structures called clayshians. Their lives were extremely difficult with little to no contact with the outside world. They also suffered from rampant disease and high levels of malnutrition. There's around 1,260 of these clayshians on Herta and 170 on the surrounding islands. They're slowly falling into a state of ruin despite their historic value. Today, the islands are a UNESCO World Heritage Site for both their natural and cultural qualities. St. Kilda currently has no permanent year-round residents with the exception of military personnel, who stay at a small military base on Herta that was built in 1957. The islands are a breeding ground for large migratory seabird populations, so many conservation workers and scientists spend time there during the summer months. They're also home to surviving early sheep species, the soay and the borare. Herta welcomes visitors today, and its underwater caves and marine environment offers a unique diving experience. 3. Suakin Island Ruins. During the 10th century BC, the Egyptian Emperor Ramses III developed the port city of Suakin on a small island in what is now northern Sudan. Located in the Red Sea, Suakin was a major trading hub for around 3,000 years. More than 1,000 years after it was established, the city became a considerable stopping point for Islamic pilgrims heading to Mecca. Suakin was immensely prosperous and brought great wealth to the region. It was filled with luxurious, elaborately decorated buildings made from coral. According to local legend, a king once lived there with his 360 wives. The city underwent its final transformation phase during the 19th century, when its importance as a trading hub diminished. Suakin fell into neglect and reached a state of disrepair by the 1920s. Its buildings were disintegrating, and today they're in ruins. The port no longer attracts the commerce that once defined it as a major power, but it does draw tourists who are eager to catch a glimpse of a past era. It also continues to act as a link for pilgrims along their trek to Mecca and for other travelers making their way from Africa to the Middle East. 2. Holland Island. Located in the Chesapeake Bay off the coast of Maryland, Holland Island was first settled during the 17th century. By 1910, it was home to a fishing community of around 350 people. At its peak, the 5-mile-long landmass consisted of almost 70 homes, as well as a church, school, and post office. Holland Island was made of silt and mud, and it lacked a rock foundation. Consequently, erosion and rising sea levels began taking a toll around 1914, leaving residents with no choice but to flee in the following years. By 1922, the island was completely abandoned. Some of the buildings, including the local church, were relocated to the mainland. In the meantime, Holland Island continued receding into the bay, turning solid ground into marshland before being consumed entirely by water. Eventually, all that was left was a 2-story home. A storm crumbled the sole remaining house in November 2010, and the only visible remnants of Holland Island were debris and marsh patches. By 2012, any evidence that the island ever existed had slipped completely beneath the water's surface. 1. McNab's Island. Off the coast of Nova Scotia in Halifax Harbour, Canada, there's an island filled with abandoned modern-era structures and military installations. Known today as McNab's Island, it was originally called Cornwallis Island, and its recorded history dates back to the 18th century. During the 1780s, a man named Peter McNab settled there. His descendants remained on the island until 1934. No major settlements were built on McNab's Island after the family left. It was used mainly for military purposes, and it continued to be abandoned since the end of World War II. The ruins there today consist of old military forts, as well as the foundations of early settlers' homes. There's also a cemetery that holds the remains of some of the island's first inhabitants. McNab Island spans roughly 980 acres, making it the biggest island in Halifax Harbour. Most of it is owned by the federal government and the province of Nova Scotia, and several of its historic structures are protected landmarks. Only 3% of McNab Island is privately owned. There's still a handful of permanent residents, but for the most part, it's filled with quiet, crumbling reminders of the past.
Number 3. Ill-fated sister ships. Built during the 1970s, the Liberian sister ships MS Burj Istra and the MS Burj Vanga were bulk oil carriers designed to carry both wet and dry cargo. They were owned by one of the world's biggest shipping companies at the time, a Norwegian business called Sig O Bergesen DY. While sailing from Tubarão, Brazil to Japan with iron ore in December of 1975, the MS Burj Istra suddenly went missing. Authorities launched a search in early 1976 after receiving no communication from the ship for nearly a week. The effort was called off 9 days later after no signs of the vanished vessel turned up, and the entire crew was presumed dead. 2 days later, crew members Imeldo Barreto Leon and Epifanio Lopez were rescued by some Japanese fishermen. They said they were painting the Burj Istra's bow when it was somehow shaken by a series of explosions, causing the whole deck to open up. The ship was sucked under the waves within seconds and nearly took the men with it. But Leon managed to climb to a life raft that had fallen off the vessel, and he pulled the unconscious Lopez on with him. They spent 20 days on the raft before they were rescued and said that the remaining 30 crew members probably died when the ship went down. Sig O Bergesen DY was tight-lipped about the disaster from the very beginning. If company officials knew anything about what caused the ship to implode, they never told the public. To make matters even more strange, the MS Burj Vanga disappeared under similar circumstances just 4 years later in October 1979. Like its ill-fated sister ship, the Berge Vanga was sailing from Brazil to Japan with iron ore when it fell out of contact in the South Atlantic. A search effort failed to find any trace of the vessel, and all 40 crew members were presumed dead. Traces of debris resembling the ship eventually popped up northwest of Tristan da Cunha, one of the world's most secluded populated islands, but none of the crew's bodies were ever found. There was an investigative hearing after the Berge Vanga's bizarre disappearance, but it was held behind closed doors with no info leaked to the public. Much like the Berge Istra, its findings were never shared, and its tragic fate remains shrouded in mystery and suspicion to this day. Many have speculated that the Berge Vanga exploded like its sister ship, and that the explosions were caused by oil residue in the cargo compartments. But Bergeson never confirmed nor denied this detailed theory. In 2001, one of the company's former captains, Johnny Ehlers, told the Norwegian newspaper Dagbladet that he believed that the wing tanks of the Berge Istra, the first ship that sank, were never cleaned properly after delivering some oil. He said that at the time, it was common for officers to lack the proper knowledge on how to measure the ship's gas levels, and that vessels often had very unreliable gas systems. This would have made it fairly easy for the oil tanks to go unnoticed, leading to the production of oil vapor and eventually fire. Ehlers went on to explain that the deck's water seal was unreliable in heavy seas, which would have made it possible for the vapor to leak into the ship's gas system and generator. In keeping with Japan's maritime and shipping laws, which required inert wing tanks upon arrival, the crew would have started the generator while heading toward the country. If this is what truly happened, the ensuing explosion would have looked a lot like what the two survivors described seeing. While this explanation seems likely, the only people who have any solid knowledge about what happened continue to keep quiet on the matter. What do you think caused these sister ships to suddenly disappear, never to be seen again? Let me know in the comments below. Number 2. What ate a great white shark? In 2003, scientists tagged a female great white shark off Australia's southwestern coast to record water temperatures and depths. 4 months later, the data indicated that the 9-foot-long shark somehow abruptly dove to a depth of 1,903 feet. The tag's surrounding temperatures spiked from 46 Fahrenheit to over 78 degrees Fahrenheit as well. Filmmaker David Riggs, who was documenting the project, was shocked by the sudden changes. In a self-recorded video, he said that something must have eaten the shark and taken its tag with it. At the same time, he seemed amazed by the possibility, asking, what could kill a 3-meter great white? A beachcomber found the tag just 2.5 miles from where scientists attached it to the shark months earlier. While the creature's fate remained a mystery, this was a telling piece of evidence that pointed toward the shark meeting a violent or possibly tragic end. In 2014, the Smithsonian Channel uploaded the footage of Riggs reacting to the bizarre changes in the missing shark's tag data to their YouTube channel. The video went viral, once again raising the now years-old question of what could have possibly eaten one of the world's top marine predators. 23 million years ago, a shark much larger than the great whites of today came into existence. Known as the megalodon, experts believe that it could grow up to 66 feet and weighed as much as 114 tons. These killing machines were armed with razor-sharp teeth, measuring up to 7 inches long, which were specifically designed for ripping the flesh off large prey like whales and dolphins. Some people believe the megalodon could still exist today, lurking in the dark, mysterious ocean depths, almost entirely inaccessible to human eyes. It's true that only a small percentage of the world's oceans have been fully explored by scientists, and if the megalodon is really still out there, it would certainly be capable of effortlessly tearing a great white shark to pieces. But this is highly unlikely. The most recent megalodon fossils date back to about 3.5 million years ago, indicating that the species went extinct somehow during that time. Scientists also believe that the megalodon lived in shallow coastal waters, ruling out any likelihood that they're still around, hiding in a place humans can't find them. It's easy to understand why some people believe the megalodon is still out there. After all, it's difficult to picture almost any modern animal taking down a great white. With a swimming speed of up to 43 miles per hour, mouth filled with hundreds of pointed teeth, and the ability to sniff out a drop of blood among billions of drops of water, the species seems far more badass and powerful than the most vicious of carnivores. Orcas, also known as killer whales, are one of the species' few known natural predators. While the largest great whites can reach up to 20 feet or longer and weigh as much as 5,000 pounds, they're not all that big, especially when they're younger. On average, a newborn great white is 3.3 feet long. Because of this small size, juvenile sharks are more appealing to orcas and other predators, including cannibalistic great whites. But even full-grown members of the species are vulnerable to ending up on another creature's dinner plate. During his time as a doctoral student at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts, a shark researcher named Carmen Braun told National Geographic that cannibalism among great whites is actually very common among juveniles and adults. He explained that great whites are opportunistic and have a varied diet, which means that eating one of their own falls well within the realm of possibilities. And while scientists may never know for certain what happened to the tagged female shark that vanished in 2003, the general consensus is that she probably fell victim to a member of her species or perhaps a hungry killer whale. Number 1. The Cursed Gulf of Mexico Shipwreck. ExxonMobil workers were laying an oil pipeline in the Gulf of Mexico in the late 1980s when they noticed something strange on the seafloor, almost 2,700 feet below the water's surface. Years later, it was formally identified as a 65-foot-long sunken ship. In 2002, a team of marine archaeologists from Texas A&M University decided to test out some of their new robotic equipment on the wreck to learn more about its origins. They initially believed that the ship dated back to sometime in the early 19th century. Known simply as the Gulf of Mexico wreck, it was the first sunken ship explored in deep waters off the U.S. coast. The expedition coordinator, Jeff Phaneuf, went into the project optimistically and was confident his team would identify the vessel quickly. In doing so, they would learn about its history through some records and other evidence that had helped tell its story. But that never happened, and the wreck's identity has stayed a mystery to this day. To add to the frustration of not identifying it, many things went wrong during the researchers' efforts to explore the ship. On more than one occasion, their equipment malfunctioned at the worst possible times. A New York Times article by Kenneth Chang describes how the team's robot submarine steered out of control the moment it entered the water during one of the first attempts investigating the wreck. The sub's tether was entangled in the research ship's propellers, and the vessel was yanked beneath the ship. The only parts of the rover that returned to the water's surface were shredded pieces of foam, as if to let the scientists know the machine was destroyed beyond any hope of saving it. When a scientist and a 12-person crew traveled to the wreck site on the Navy research submarine NR-1, they were lucky enough to get some footage of the ship, but they were disappointed after realizing the vehicle's arms were too short to actually lift any artifacts they wanted to study more closely. A few days later, the NR-1's captain was able to grab a piece of the ship with the submarine's robotic arm, bringing some renewed hope to Phaneuf and his colleagues that they would get some valuable insight into the wreck's origins. But a hydraulic failure caused the artifact to slip out of the arm's hold as it was being carried to the surface. It seemed as if it were being pulled back into the dark abyss that it came from. Phaneuf told the New York Times that his team spent 2 days searching for the piece, but never found it. In addition to malfunctioning equipment, they also experienced delays that stopped them from going to the site. In one instance, some debris got caught in their ship's propeller, forcing them to turn back and get repairs. Their repeated failures to investigate the wreck or collect artifacts led Phaneuf to jokingly wonder if the ship was cursed, or if perhaps the spirits of those who went down with it didn't want to be disturbed by modern technology. After more attempts to gather evidence, the researchers only managed to bring one item to the surface, an 11 by 6 inch scrap of copper that ripped off the ship's hull when they pulled on it with a robotic arm. On its own, it revealed nothing about the vessel's identity, leaving the team to rely solely on the footage they gathered for clues. They observed porcelain, pieces of metal, and other objects, but noticed the wreck was strangely devoid of any visible cargo. There were no signs of the ship's name on anything, which would have been the most valuable piece of information they could have come across. The most telling evidence scientists found was the sheet of copper covering the hull that they accidentally ripped a piece off of. During the late 18th century, the British Navy covered the hulls of its ships with copper to prevent shipworms from destroying the wood. For a short time, the practice became popular among military and commercial vessels. But it was expensive, and by the mid-19th century, shipbuilders started using sheaths made from copper alloys instead of pure copper. The team also noticed that the copper sheets were nailed to the hull by hand, helping them narrow down the likely time frame of the wreck to the early 19th century. Based on what little information they had to go off of, they determined that the ship went down in the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. FNUF shared their limited findings with marine archaeologist Dr. Jack B. Irion of the U.S. Minerals Management Service. A few days later, Irion found a historical report detailing the sinking of a Canadian ship called the Western Empire. It was built during 1862 and was abandoned during a hurricane in 1875. Its dimensions match the vessel's known length, and the Western Empire is the only known shipwreck in the region. But FNUF's team had doubts that the wreck they explored was truly the Western Empire. Although they collected such little information, the sunken ship's features don't fit the time frame for when the Western Empire was made. And while they never identified the wreck or determined whether it was a naval or commercial vessel, they were certain of one thing: it's a different ship from a different time. Unfortunately, until another group of researchers decides to pick up where the previous team left off, this wreck will remain shrouded in mystery. Thanks for watching. Have you heard of any other strange ocean mysteries? Let us know down below. If you enjoyed today's video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and while you're at it, don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.